Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live stream and career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. And on this episode, my guest is a singer-songwriter who, much like Paul Weller, has a unique ability to tell stories through powerful lyrics that live in our hearts and minds. I'm talking Up the Junction, Call for Cats, Hourglass, Slap and Tickle, Labelled with Love, Some Fantastic Place. I could go on forever. The amazing Chris Difford joins me for episode 32, legendary lyricist and all-round musical legend, founding member of the fabulous band Squeeze with Glenn Tilbrook. Now, I can't recommend his autobiography enough too. So many great stories within, all beautifully told as you'd expect. So let's get into it. Chris Difford, thanks for joining me.
It's good to be here.
Squeeze are such a brilliant band. I've seen you live so many times. I love you guys. If there were a series 2, it would be Squeeze. It would be Desperately Seeking Squeeze, I have to say. You guys are great. So many elements of your story to me seem to either run parallel to Paul Weller's, because you have so much in common around the timings of things, but also your paths collide and cross in some really beautiful ways at times too. So we'll get into it, shall we?
Sure, go ahead, fire ahead.
Now, I'm going to kick off with 1972 because this is the year that the Jam formed and Paul Weller got together with Steve Brooks at that time. But it's also, from my understanding, the time that you started your first band as well. Was it Porky's Falling Spikes? Was that right?
Yeah, I had no idea Paul was ahead of the game at that point. I had Porky's Falling Spikes, but it was more like a school band. It wasn't really anything other than just a bunch of kids making a bit of noise and opposing a bit and smoking fags. It wasn't really, I don't think we had any intentions of being on top of the pops.
Just to have some fun. But I think that was the same thing because this was at Shearwater School for Paul. So a similar thing. As you go through those early days of the Squeeze, the timings is almost exactly the same as the Jam. But initially for you, you just wanted to be David Bowie in the beginning. Was that right?
I went to see him and I was really knocked out with his lyrics and by his presence. I never wanted to be like him. I could only be like myself, really. But lyrically, it was something that inspired me and I wanted to chase that. But then, I was into the Small Faces and the Who, and lyrically they weren't the same, but they were still inspirational from a point of view of they were young lads in a band. And that was the most important thing, young lads in a band, which, all these years later, I still love the idea of. And
that band, as we get into Squeeze, similarly to the Jam, just had so much energy, just seems so much fun in the sense that it was, often people on this podcast have talked about the Jam and the Style Council being like a youth club. It was a very, very young band, and you met Glen in 1973, and this story of you getting to know each other that's in your autobiography, this courtship between the two of you is really lovely, because in the first year you wrote like 137 songs together.
We did, but they weren't all very, they weren't all great. They were just songs. And the whole point of the union of us coming together was to write and to sort of mine ideas to see where it would lead. I don't think, speaking from my point of view, I don't think I ever thought that we'd be here all these years later. I thought that we'd maybe rattle some cages and then move on. But it seemed like our relationship just kind of grew.
So part of this podcast is me talking about the fact that 10 years ago, I gave up my life as a radio presenter without being able to interview Paul. I didn't get to, that was one big regret, but I did get to chat to Glen, and I chatted to Glen probably around the time that Ridiculous came out. And I owe you an apology because I hadn't realized how you divvied up the work, if you like, in a way. That you were the guy who came up with the words and Glen was the chap who came up with the music. And this beautiful collaboration between the two of you worked so well because I was there complimenting him on the words that had really connected with me and the lyrics and everyone who was like going, oh no, that was Chris. That was Chris. How did you decide that those were your strengths as a poet, essentially, and somebody able to write great lyrics for songs?
Well, Glen was just constantly playing guitar and piano, and he was more musically minded, and I was constantly sharpening pencils and writing down words. So it became natural, very apparent that was going to be how we were going to divvy things up. It's kind of an unspoken coming together, really. We just sort of fell into place. I don't think there was a lot of time put into figuring out who would do what. It just became apparent.
the timings of your first album was just very shortly after In the City and Modern World. How much were you into the Jam, and how much was that a part of your world?
To be honest, I don't think I really paid much attention to what was going on outside of my own world. The first time I remember the Jam was when they supported Squeeze at the Marquee a couple of times, and their energy and their assault on stage was just genius. It was like seeing The Who or the Small Faces. It was a band that I wanted to be in. I thought, well, if they ever got room, I'd be in them in a nano. But and I met their dad, and he was a lovely guy. And I have to say, the whole family, the Weller family, are gracious people. I've learned that over the years. I have a great respect for Paul. I think the way that he devotes himself to being Paul Weller is extraordinary. You know, even during the lockdown, I realised that he's just recorded yet another album. And why not? I mean, that's who he is. He's Paul Weller. He's got his own place. He needs to fill space in his head and in his heart, and that's what he does.
So much of the links that I thought to talk about as well was this power of lyrics and the power of the word in your songs, because it means something. Not only do you write great songs, but you run like songwriting retreats. And I've always looked at these and thought, I'd love to have some kind of ounce of talent to be able to join a 5-day retreat with you to learn how to write songs or to work on my craft, you know. But I've got no talent in that space whatsoever. But the actual words in your songs are really important, aren't they?
Well, as a lyricist, yeah, it's everything for me, and that's what I concentrate on, and that's what keeps bringing me back to the shed. You know, that's kind of what I do. I write lyrics for whoever is looking for them within reason. I don't really write for a lot of people, but when I get asked, I kind of think about it, and I generally accept if I think it's going to be a very good project. And in fact, Paul did ask me to write for him once, and I went to Solid Bond Studios, and he gave me, we sat around for a couple of hours, and he played me a couple of demos and songs that he had on the boil. And then he gave me a cassette of like maybe 6 songs. And he said, if you come up with anything, you know, let me know. He was very sort of open about it. And I went away with the cassette and I listened to it. And I think I did come up with some ideas. I sent them to him, but we didn't really expand upon it. I think I was a little bit too floral for him at the time.
Wow. When was that? What period would that have been? Solo or Style Council? Or can you remember?
It would have been after the Jam, but before the Style Council around that time.
Wow, God.
Well, it's when he only had Solid Bond for a while, you know.
Right. And it fascinates me how some of these songs can come so easy to you both. So Up the Junction was a song that you wrote in one sitting. Paul talks about That's Entertainment as something he just wrote in 10 minutes. And you get this idea that sometimes the songs write themselves. Presumably other things take are really painful to get through.
No. If they're of any use, if they're any good, then they come in 5 or 10 minutes. Wow. If they're rubbish, then it means you've got to keep going back and welding them together, and then they don't look very good. So I'm with Paul, really. If I've got an idea and it works, then it works.
If not, you just scrap it and don't bother. Or it becomes a note in a notebook that you might return to at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly throwing stuff away because I think, well, why should I waste my time on this if it doesn't really jump out of the box? So, you know, if I'm writing and something completes itself within 5-10 minutes, then I normally know it's going to be all right.
Wow. And when you come up with a killer lyric, so there was a line that, I mean, there's so many lines, but there's one particular line that always stands out to me, which is a song that probably not many people talk to you about, which is a song called Wicked and Cruel. And there's this line which is, if I come back as her, would I love me? And it's honestly just a brilliant, brilliant line. And it probably doesn't like a throwaway line maybe for you, but for some reason that connected. When you come up with those lines, do you write something and then go, bloody hell, that's brilliant, and do a little jog around the garden or have an extra cup of tea?
Well, thanks for bringing that song up. It is a brilliant song for all different manner of reasons, not least Glen's vocal on it is extraordinary. But, you know, lyrics like that, it takes me years to fathom out where they come from. I don't really jog around the garden very much, particularly. I'm not looking for that kind of self-satisfaction. I think I'm just very lucky, I suppose, to be blessed with the imagination that my mum and dad gave me to be able to sit and write songs. You know, some people try and educate songwriting by supposedly teaching it, which you can't do, I don't believe. It's more of an emotional belonging.
And so many of the lyrics come from your heart, from reading your autobiography as well. It helps to get more of an understanding of that. But you sense that always just in hearing the song in the first place, but as you dig a bit deeper. And that seems to be the same for Paul as well. You're writing, it's not like you're writing to create a top 40, top 10 hit, big selling single. I don't know if that's ever been the case. It's more that you're digging into your own psyche and your own belief of what you want to just get out there, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't think commercially at all. I don't think we ever have done. I mean, yes, it's great to have hits. It's great to have radio play, but I don't bother about it. If we don't make the Radio 2 playlist, which is where we are these days, it doesn't bother me. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I think the early success that we had is still a meal that I'm consuming. So it's kind of, it's an ongoing appreciation of the simple things in life, which music is a simple thing.
When the band was at its height in terms of the late 70s, 80s, and that first incarnation, and you were smashing out single after single that was doing incredibly well. So Up the Junction, Tempted, Hourglass, those kind of songs that are still part of your set list today. And we'll talk about the new stuff in a sec too. The live experience seems like I don't know, it seems a terrifying one from your point of view to a certain extent, but these crowds were massive when you're touring all over the world, the US particularly. I mean, you've got bands, I mean, some great bands supporting you. You mentioned the Jam at one point, but the Specials, REM, Dire Straits, bands like that. I'm trying to explain to people how big this was, how much of that was fun versus actually having to write the next hit to be able to continue to sell out those tours and stuff.
Well, I think if you become a bus driver, you know that you've got to go from one end of the route to the other, and then you've got to start all over again. And that's really what being in a band is like. You start off writing the songs, you rehearse them, record them, go out on the road, and then when you tire it out, you start again. As it got bigger and bigger over the years, it was consuming, and it was wonderful, I have to say. Those larger audiences were just as amazing as the audiences we had at the Marquee Club, but in a different kind of way. Today, we still play to large audiences, particularly in America. I'm very grateful for the fact that our music has stayed the test of time. And also, I'm very pleased that, for instance, Paul is now embracing America and touring there more and more often, because his music is beginning, or has begun, to be more accepted there. And I know for a long time we were out on tour and I used to think, why isn't Paul over here? You know, it's kind of like the perfect place for him. I think we've done over 70 tours of America and it just keeps growing, which is a wonderful thing. I don't know what we're going to be doing about it in the next 12 months, but let's hope we can go back.
I mentioned the parallels with Paul and the Jam. Squeeze, really, you split at the height of your fame in that first part, 1983. Paul disbanded the Jam tail end of 1982. And that was very much a Paul decision, and the rest of the band had to, live with it. For Squeeze, it was more of a understanding between the two of you that at that point it had run its course, or it was time for a break and do something different. Would that be right?
Yeah, we were knackered, and, I think it was good just to sit down and have a rest from being squeezed. We did it in a haphazard kind of way. And like Paul, I think you get to a point where, okay, you know each other inside out. You've written all your best stuff that you could possibly do in that period of time. There are different egos at play within the band, possibly. You just need some fresh air around you, really. You can't just keep carrying on. It exhausts you. So looking back, I'm glad that we did it. And, we've broken up and got back together 3 times, I think, now. So we're getting very good at it.
One of the times when my radio career was taking off and I really got into you guys and was seeing you live, it was around 93. Yeah, so Some Fantastic Place, I'm guessing would have been around 93. And Ridiculous and those albums, which I loved. I thought, and you were still are so bloody good live. There's clearly a relationship there that you can't, as much as circumstances might make this not work all the time, you can't kind of break it off completely. You're always kind of bouncing back to each other because you make such great songs together and make it great. It just works, doesn't it?
It does work. Really what's happened in the last year because of the pandemic, it's given us a time to kind of break up without breaking up. We've managed to stand still and or sit still and take on board what we need to do. We need to put the car, on blocks and just sort of take it all apart and oil it and put it back together again. And I think that's what we will be doing in the next 3 or 4 months, I think.
There's one song as well, Grouch of the Day, I used to use as a radio jingle on my breakfast show and get people to ring in on who their Grouch of the Day was, which was lovely. But 2000, Paul makes Heliocentric. And I'd like to know how you pronounce it, because it's named after your studio or your studio from them, wasn't it?
Heliocentric. Yeah. He came down with his team to record for a month, I think it was. And it was chaos, but it was great fun.
Why chaos?
Well, it was chaos in a good way, like when people turn up at your house and, they sort of plug in and start playing, and they don't, because we had a family growing up there. We said to them, look, you can't really record after 10 o'clock at night because we need to get the kids to bed and all that stuff. But they didn't hear that. So quite frequently they'd be recording till like 3 or 4 in the morning, which is absolutely fine. They booked the place out. But we had some very funny times. And it was lovely to have them all there. I think Steve White was there.
Yeah, Damon Minchella mentioned the fact that they set your bedroom alight.
Well, they did. And because we live in a small village, the fire brigade came, but it was like 4 blokes who were also in bed who were being called to the fire. It was like Trumpton or something. They came flying down the drive in a fire engine just to find like 5 stoned guys standing out in a field.
Oh, amazing. There's another connection which is I hadn't twigged until I read your biography as well, which was, there's so much of it that charts your relationship with Glen and the drink and the drugs, and people should read it if only for the Bryan Ferry stories, which are just unbelievable. But Sir Elton John is another link to Paul Weller, and I'm not sure if you can guess where I'm going with this off the top of your head. The Strypes, which was a band that you managed and came via Sir Elton. Is that right? And
we brought the boys down to Paul's studio, Black Barn, and we recorded down there. And Josh, the guitar player, still plays occasionally with Paul. I think they still get on pretty well. And it was amazing to have him around. And he was very cautious around them, like a father. And I thought that was a very beautiful thing. He said to me, do you mind if I drink in front of the band? And I said, why would I bother about that? He said, because they're so young. And I said, well, they're in a rock and roll band. I think they'll get to learn about drinking, So, but it was very courteous of him to ask. Yeah,
you mentioned Josh. God, what a talent he is. Incredible. And I know he's now solo, but I saw them support Paul as well, and they were brilliant live. When you were managing them, how did that come about in terms of them supporting Paul and stuff? Was that before the Black Barn recording, or?
Yeah, I can't remember the connection other than they were big Weller fans, and I just joined the dots and made some phone calls, and the next thing I knew, he was kind enough to call me and say, look, if they want some studio time for free, it's empty next week, why don't they come down and use it? So I said, that's really kind. So the band flew in from Dublin, and we went straight down there, stayed at the house, recorded free for a week, which was really nice, with his engineer, and Paul popped in every now and again to see what was going on.
Wow, cool. And Steve Craddock's another one that I wanted to mention, because you co-wrote with him for Travel Wild, Travel Free, his album, and there was a track called 10,000 Times, which you collaborated on. How did that come about?
Really simply, he just emailed me and asked me if I'd write a lyric for him, and I said, well, God, yeah, I'd love to. I'm a massive fan. What do you want to talk about? And he got very mystical, and I thought, oh God, this is going a bit weird. And then he sent me the track, and it was very mystical, and in the end, it all came together very, very well. So.
Obviously you're a huge fan of music as well. And as Paul's career has gone, through the years from the Style Council to the solo years, and we're talking in the same way as we're talking about Squeeze, of a 40-year legacy of back catalogue. I guess there's 2 questions on that. One around Paul's new material, and have you followed that journey, and how into that have you been, and what have you loved? And then secondly, from a Squeeze point of view, when you get back on the road, how do you create a set list from this when you're still doing new albums? Because you've got, Cradle to the Grave, The Knowledge, which came out a few years back. Obviously, people want to hear the big hits, which is the same with Paul. But it must be really hard coming up with a set list that works to please everybody, yourselves to play the new material, fans who also want to hear the back catalogue and stuff.
Yeah, it is tricky. We always managed to make the set list the right one for the right tour. So I think we're okay with that stuff. We've got so much to choose from. You know, we haven't written anything recently, but I'm sure we will sometime in the future. And as for Paul's career, I have to say that hats off. I admire what he does. I think his songwriting has just got stronger and stronger. His vocal performances have got amazing. And even when he does like the new stuff that I've just listened to, I think he's pushing a boundary for himself. He's constantly challenging himself, which I think is a wonderful thing. There was a song that he brought out some years ago, and I can never remember the title of it. And I think he was questioning his alcoholism. And it was a really beautiful song. And it always bothers me. I can't remember the title of it. But it just shows how in touch he is with his feelings as well.
The drinking has come up a lot on the podcast in terms of the Wild Days of the Jam, the Style Council, the solo years, and then Paul knocking it on the head. And then he's talked about how that's enabled him now to be much freer and to be more present in terms of gigs and things. And I didn't want to touch on this too much, but I know obviously you've had the problems with alcoholism and things like that. Have you found that in recent years when you seem to have come through that and be in a better place, that actually you're more present yourself and you can understand that way of thinking from his point of view too?
Most definitely. I think I haven't sort of turned to the wacky backy or anything like that. I've kind of completely squeaky. So it's taken me a long time to really appreciate my journey. I didn't for a while, but I do now. And, you know, times like these when you're sitting around just doing nothing particularly and you're just sort of hovering and thinking about where you've been and where you're about to go, it can do nothing but make you feel grateful for life and what it's given you. You know, I'm pretty positive there's nothing else I could have ever done in my life. I could never have been a plumber or a bus driver. I'd love to have been a bus driver actually, but yeah, I just who I am, and it's been a wonderful trip. I get that sense with Paul as well. I think his journey has always been cut out for him. It's always been, you know, he's always slick. You know, he's always in GQ. He looks great for his age. He's well pickled, you know, he looks after himself. And I think that's a really wonderful thing.
There's also that understanding of when to knock the chaos on the head and it's time to move on. But also with the band that he's got, it seems that he's very good at shaking things up and bringing in new members and deciding when it's time to move into the next iteration of the Paul Weller band, if you like, or the story. Constantly working with different artists, which keeps it fresh as well. And I know that for me, again, the parallels with Squeeze, it's very similar and not always through your own choice. I know with the amount of bass players you got through, for instance, that keeps it fresh, doesn't it? So that heart of Squeeze, it's obviously you and Glen, but the rest of the lineup is very much moving at times, isn't it?
I think it's right to do that. I think it's good to have a lineup change from time to time. And we've been with the same musicians now for quite a long time, 15 years possibly. And they're absolutely brilliant. And, you know, they deliver Squeeze in a fantastic way. And we have had bass players come and go. In fact, we've shared a bass player with Paul, with Yolanda Charles, of course. And that's always a bit tricky because it's a very important part of the song, having a great bass playing lines that Glen creates. So that makes us a bit shaky, I think, sometimes. But yeah, I very much admire the way Paul changes things around. I think it's important.
To me, I'm guessing when would it have been 7 years ago when you came back for third or fourth time as Squeeze, I suppose it would be. Back to where you belong. To me, you seem much happier. You're collaborating in a different way with Glen, from what I can understand from what you've written. And you come up with this album, From the Cradle to the Grave, which is driven by Danny Baker's sitcom based on his memoirs. And then more recently, in the last, 4 years ago, The Knowledge. Was there pressure on you when you came back to be able to work together to produce some great work again? How much of that new work are you measuring up against the legacy?
There was no pressure. And there is no pressure, really. I mean, Cradle to the Grave, there was pressure insofar as there was a TV show to land the songs on. So we had to get them ready in time. And because we hadn't written as a partnership for over 15 years, we had to kind of learn how to be in each other's company. And that took some doing. It took some time. And then when we did The Knowledge, it was like an extension in a way of the Cradle to the Grave album, but not quite as successful, I don't think. It didn't have the spark that Cradle to the Grave had, although it has some fantastic songs on it, I have to say. So we're still young as songwriters. We've still got a lot to learn. But our legacy, as you say, the music that we've written over the past 47 years, still needs looking after.
And there's a couple of other questions I wanted to ask you around writing lyrics, if that's all right. So one was, I was talking about the Style Council with a couple of guests and how Paul would bring in these amazingly well-written songs for them to work on in terms of the music and the sound and collaborating on. But he'd pretty much bring in these finished lyrics and the reaction to these incredible lyrics that he was writing. Do you know how Glenn has felt about you sending, because at one point you were sending these in the post, presumably. I'm guessing that's not how it works now. Is it an email job? But how Glenn would feel about receiving these incredible lyrics from you and having this material to work with must have been amazing, and very similar to Paul, I would imagine, when he's bringing this stuff to his band too.
He's pretty secretive about it, really. He works at a different pace to me. He doesn't like to sort of just open the envelope and read all the words. He kind of takes his time, and which is perfect for him, and that's the way that he works. So he'll put one lyric up on the piano or get in front of him, and he'll give it a go and see what happens. So, for me, sometimes my job is done like months before we finish a record, months before, like if I deliver the lyrics in January, we might not get everything done until September, but I've done everything that I can possibly do apart from chip in. I think we have a unique way of working, which has grown over the years.
Many of the gaps of Squeeze, you've been doing solo material too. And I know that loads of collaborations as well, but is there a different way of you writing when you're writing with a tune in mind as well as writing the lyrics, which is different to Squeeze?
Well, I'm always writing with a tune in mind.
Oh, are you? Okay.
But I never tell Glenn what tune it is.
Do they occasionally ever collide or not really?
No, they don't. But, so it's... Whoever I'm writing for, there's always a tune in my head.
Oh, wow.
But I just keep that to myself.
There must have been times where you're like, oh, that's not the tune I had. The one in my head was much better.
No, it's just really for the basic foundation of the lyric itself, for the rhythm, for the scanning.
I love that. I didn't realise that. This has been so lovely, Chris. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You mentioned about the Jam supporting you on tour. I can't remember if you remember writing this. At the very least, remember experiencing this. But page 102, you mentioned the Jam supporting you at the Marquee. Can you remember the story about the microphones?
Yeah, Paul's dad accused us of nicking his mic stands and the microphones, which we didn't do, which was... I am a bit of a tea leaf, and I would have nicked them back in the day. But I wouldn't have nicked them from the Jam because they were so brilliant. If it had been a shit band, then yeah, I would have nicked them. So I was accused of doing something that I clearly didn't do.
Chris, this has been so lovely. Two final questions then. You're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or solo. Which one is it going to be?
What's the new one called?
There's one that's literally come out today called Glad Times. The one that sounds a bit Iggy Pop.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
Yeah, Cosmic Fringes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about that one? Is that because it's new and you haven't heard it before and it's...
Yeah.
Always moving forward. I love it.
Yeah.
And the purpose of this podcast is also to be able to secure a chat with Paul that wraps up the series. If there's any question I should ask, what should I tackle him about? Or a topic, anything that you think I should cover off with him?
Contraception, I would talk to him
about. Brilliant. I shall leave that there.
Right. See you soon.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. See you. Bye. Bye.
That was brilliant. My thanks once again to Chris Difford. Check out his fabulous solo work and that of Squeeze. I can't recommend enough. Next week, we head back to the start of Paul's solo career. My guest is bass player Paul Francis. Part of the Paul Weller movement back in 1990, we'll hear all about those early days of Paul after the end of the Style Council. Don't forget to share this episode on social media. You can find us on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Facebook and Instagram. It's Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I'll see you next time.